All right, so it looks like we're all here. So we're ready to get started, right?
Yep.
All right. So we're in the home stretch on ExcelerSizing. We got 2 more modules to go. Let's get this going. So by way of review, we started off talking about various business application components. Then we talked about data conversion components. Last session, we talked about data warehouse specific stuff. And today, we're going to talk about both project level components and support components. So those 2 combined. Then in our final module, we'll be talking about the modifiers. So we'll be covering quantity, area, complexity, work, and uncertainty. So for the project level components and the support components, these are a little bit different from the other pieces that we've been dealing with because they're very broad, especially the project level ones are very broad components of the work. So the 2 major areas that we find them in is consulting type work and purchased software. So we'll be talking about each of those individually. And then the third area, which is kind of in some cases, it might be purchased. In some cases, it might be developed. But it has a lot of similarity to purchased software, are frameworks. So we'll be talking about those. Then we have support components. And support components are different from the other things that we've been talking about, primarily in that their main purpose is not to add a new capability. So they don't add a new report. They don't add a new page or whatever. What they are is more of a maintenance operation or a set of maintenance work that's going to be done and but managed as a project. So it's some maintenance work that's either included in a different project, or we have a project that's going to work through a backlog of some maintenance items. When we're doing project level and support components, this is an especially important time to keep in mind our general rule, which is don't double count. So our objective when we're estimating is always to make sure that we don't neglect any area of work. So if there's something that has to be worked on that's going to take some effort, we want to make sure that that appears somewhere. But conversely, we want to make sure that we don't take the same piece of work and count it in more than one component. So we don't want to count project level components and also detailed components for the same thing. So we wouldn't count, for example, a commercial off-the-shelf software application and then separately count the individual reports and pages that are part of that application. Because if we do that, then we'll be double counting. When we would do that is if they're separate and distinct areas of work. So if we have a commercial off-the-shelf software application, and then we're adding 3 new reports, then we would count the 3 new reports separately. We don't want to count support that is already covered elsewhere. So the 2 places where it's likely to have been covered elsewhere would be somewhere in the remaining sizing components built into the size. So for example, when we are estimating the work required to install a COTS application or to build a report or a page or an interface or anything else that we've been dealing with, part of that work is test, and part of that testing work is defect repairs. So we know that when we do estimation on our forecast, we're forecasting number of defects that are discovered during the enterprise test effort. And those defects are broken down by priority or criticality and so on. So the work required to fix those defects that were introduced by the project is already built into the project budget. So we don't want to separately count that by calling out those defects. But now let's take a different situation where we have a system that's in production, and during the production work, there's been a backlog of 50 defects that have been discovered and that are outstanding. So we're going to create a project to come in and clear that backlog of 50 defects. Well, in that case, we would use the defect component to estimate the work for that project to come in and clear those defects. Let's take another situation. We have a vendor that has delivered software and it's got 300 outstanding defects. the quality is pretty poor, and you guys decide that you want to just walk away. So the vendor is going to leave behind the code that they've developed to date in an as-is condition. But as part of the negotiated settlement, you might want to assess a value of the cost of fixing those defects. Well, you could go in and put in the number of defects and so on. Oh, the other example is we're already estimating costs that are maintenance and operations costs. So these include corrective, perfective, enhancements, operations, and so on. So those costs are already calculated and determined as part of the ongoing costs for the code. So if we're going to be counting those and budgeting for those as part of our operational budget, as opposed to our project budget, once again, those are areas that we would not want to separately estimate. Now, in ExcelerPlan, we have this concept of core hours, which are basically your engineering or your programming, code and unit test kind of hours. So they're the core hours where somebody's doing some hands-on work. And the way we set this up is we differentiate between core hours that are development, in other words, they're done by the application group, versus core hours that are engineering, in other words, they're normally done by the infrastructure group. And we're going to see that there are some ExcelerSize high-level objects, the same exact component by name, that appears in both the ExcelerSize catalog and also in the ODC other catalog. So in that situation, the work, if you put that work into the ExcelerSize catalog, what we're estimating is the work for the application development group to do that work. On the other hand, if we put the work into the ODC other catalog, then we're estimating the work for the infrastructure or the engineering group to do the work. Examples of things that fit in both categories are the implementation of a service, a configuration, or consulting. So ExcelerSize assumes that core work by the application development team, while ODC other assumes core work by the infrastructure or the engineering team. So when you're estimating, you want to make sure that you place the work where it belongs. And it's possible that the same work may belong in one or in the other or in both. So if we use service as an example, with ExcelerSize, the work that we're estimating is the work to write or modify or test a software service. Whereas if we use ODC other for a service, what we're talking about is the work to install a service into the middleware. So for example, into Tivoli or whatever else you're using for middleware. So it's still a service, but the work that's involved, the type of work that's involved, the people who are going to be doing that work is different. All right, let's talk about consulting. Consulting is used if we're going to need to do as part of this project some consulting or some advisory work that goes beyond the work that will be performed supporting the other elements of the estimate. So examples where it would be appropriate to use consulting as a separately called out line item would be, this project only involves providing consulting support. There is no development. So we've got an application, it's having performance problems. So what we want to do is we want to come in there and do some consulting to figure out why are there performance problems. So the only work that's involved is consulting. Second example would be the consulting work is broader in scope than the development work. So that might be a situation where we're getting in there and we're adding a couple of new reports, but they say, oh, and while you're in there, we'd also like you to look at the way we're doing sign-on and user authentication. So that's a security consulting kind of piece of work. It's broader in scope than just the reports that we're estimating separately. And the third category is situations where, for whatever reason, the consulting work is expected to be unusually difficult. So perhaps we already know that there's some performance issues with this particular application. We're getting in there and we're adding some new reports and some interfaces and some pages, and we're doing a bunch of other work. But at the same time, we already know that there's going to be some performance issues, and so we want to add an additional budget line item for performance consulting. The types of consulting are broken down into 4 different categories. Configuration, what we're talking about is analyzing and understanding and recommending things with respect to configuration. So if the configuration consulting is by our application group, then it's normally configuration approaches or settings and so on for the application software. So this might be things like product codes. It might be configurations that drive behavior, business logic, and so on. If we're talking the infrastructure group and configuration, we might be talking about setting up a gateway or setting up a firewall or configuring the virtualization to improve performance, or not to improve performance, but to change the configuration for the virtualization settings. Then the second category is performance. So here what we're talking about is response time of the system. So if you think about it, performance may be improved by changing the way our hardware is set up. So we may be modifying the hardware, we may be adding memory, we may be changing the virtualization strategy, and so on. So that would be performance consulting by the engineering group. Or it may be changes by the application development team. So it might be adding an index to the database. It might be modifying an algorithm, rewriting some code that's particularly bad. So performance can either be on either side. The third category is security. So what we're talking about here is authentication. So sign-on type stuff. We're talking about maintaining data integrity type issues. We're talking about rules for protection of the data. We're talking about compliance with standards, all of that type of stuff. And so once again, the security consulting may involve changes on the infrastructure of the hardware side, or it may involve changes on the application side. And then finally, we have this other category, which is just some consulting work that needs to be done, but it doesn't fit in one of these 3 other categories. Now, when we talk about applications, so for highly reusable applications and frameworks, these would often be commercial off-the-shelf software type things, and they're broken down into 3 major categories. So we have applications, which are fully functional applications. So for example, SAP R3, which is the core SAP component. Or it might be a purchased application that's business specific, so maybe a commercial lending system or a document flow system. So it's something like that. The second layer under there is a module. So this would be a fully functional specialized component that would be added to an application. So for example, with SAP, we have SAP R3, which is the core SAP system. And then we may have a module where, for example, we have a human resources module that has human resources specific capabilities that will be then added to the application. And the third level down is a framework. So a framework is a collection of styles or a collection of capabilities or a collection of components that are then used to build and deploy an application. So in itself, a framework does not provide business functionality, but it provides a lot of building blocks and tools that simplify the ultimate provision of that business functionality. And the application and the modules, normally those are going to be things that you're purchasing. Unless you're an application vendor that's building commercial off-the-shelf software, those would be normally things that are purchased. Framework, on the other hand, may be something that's purchased or maybe something that's developed. Configuration is when data settings data settings that are entered and that then determine subsequent software behavior or hardware behavior in the case of hardware. Examples of configurations are security roles, payroll tax settings, or in the case of hardware, firewall configuration. A defect repair is repair of an application defect. So repair of defects introduced during development is included with the development catalog element, report page or whatever. So this item is for pre-existing defects that were created outside the scope of this project. So typically this is going to be used for a remediation project to come in and clear a defect backlog. A patch is the installation of a vendor software patch. Patches are different from upgrades in that the functionality of the application does not change. So there's no enhanced functionality or capabilities and so on. It's really just it can be a security patch. It's something that's often fixing some defects of some kind within the software. Patches are, that are installed during a project are already included in that project budget. So if an application is working with SAP, there's already a budget within the project for installing, in SAP they're called OSS, which are OSS or OSS patches. So if you're doing an SAP estimate, as some OSS upgrades come in during the life of that project for the system that you're working with, the installation of those patches is already covered as part of the project budget. Similarly, let's say that we're doing a Windows application. There's already a budget in the project for Windows, monthly installation patches to keep the software current. That's already built in. So that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a typically small standalone project where we want to come in and just install a vendor patch. So we have a system that's in production, it's running, and maybe there's 2 or 3 OSS patches that need to be installed, and we want to estimate the effort for doing that. A reference architecture is a set of closely related infrastructure components. So an example of, or examples of reference architectures would be .NET, Internet Explorer, Oracle 11G, etc. And reference architectures normally include both the name of the reference architecture component and also the version number. So you would normally say reference architecture is .NET 3.0 or Internet Explorer 9.0. An uplift is a version upgrade of a reference architecture. So we're taking a reference architecture, maybe .NET 3.1, let's say, and we're doing an uplift to upgrade that to .NET version 4. So it's a change. It's different from a patch because there normally will be some changed, modified functionality that goes with that version change. All right, actually, before we jump into the student exercises, does anybody have any questions about the project level or the support components?
There was a section where you talked about the framework collection of styles, capabilities, or components.
Yeah.
What was, okay. And what was the slide just before that? Okay, can I see the slide 9 again? Okay, all right, cool, thanks.
Got it, okay.
Yep.
Any other questions?
William, this may be off topic, but in the in Exceler plan, there is the option on, I believe it's the work breakdown structure or the profile, somewhere on the input project page, to show uplift as a type or selection there. When would we choose that versus full life cycle or project?
If you're doing when you're selecting those, what you're picking is the primary nature of the project. So whether that's a labor profile or an artifact list or a work breakdown structure, we're saying, what's the primary purpose of this project? So if the primary purpose of this project is to do one or more reference architecture uplifts, then you would pick it there. So keep in mind what those are doing. If we say RA uplift for WBS, then the tasks and the work split among those tasks is going to be optimized for a reference architecture uplift project. The labor is going to be optimized for a reference architecture uplift project. The deliverable documents and test cases will be optimized for a reference architecture uplift project. Conversely, if we pick full life cycle, then the task list, the labor, and the list of documents and test cases and so on will be optimized for a full life cycle development project.
Yeah, because I've seen the difference in hours. It's significantly less if we were to change, like if we were estimating it, assuming full life cycle, and then we changed it to just be uplift, it is like a fragment of the hours. I don't know how much less, but it can go from something really large to a lot lower. So
Sure.
I've sort of been hesitant to use it because of that. But we do have a lot of efforts that we call evergreening that are just, replacing servers or databases or, getting things up to the latest approved version.
Sure. So let's think about this and the reason why the reference architecture would be the preferred choice in those evergreening projects. Let's say that we're going to be doing a .NET, uplift. So we estimate we use that as our sizing component, and that's going to give us a size and function point equivalence. But now let's say that let's take a simple example of the artifacts to illustrate this. Let's say that we picked full life cycle. That would say that we're going to generate a requirement spec and a design spec and a set of detailed design and a development plan and all these different documents, which are not needed just to do a .NET upgrade. But conversely, let's say that we picked RA uplift as our artifact template. Now we're going to create maybe one or two documents, very much simpler documents. So because of that, the work is a lot less. The same thing with the labor, with the test cases that are generated. It'll be less test cases and different types of test cases. Same thing with the work breakdown structure. There's a lot of activities that don't need to be done if we're just doing a reference architecture uplift.
That decreases like business analyst hours and maybe some hours in some of the other standard roles?
Exactly. It really optimizes, if you pick RA uplift, it really optimizes things around a project whose really primary purpose is just to do that evergreening uplift.
Now, for that type of evergreening uplift, given that, okay, if you have a subsystem like a database subsystem or even, for example, IE11, but let's just go back to the database side, and you have a lot of applications that you are will have to be validated and could potentially be impacted by that uplift. What's the best way to account for that work?
It's the optimum way in terms of accuracy would be to do two different estimates. One would be for the work to do the uplift itself, and there you would use for the WBS and type and so on, you would use the RA uplift. And then the second estimate would be to do the testing of all the different impacted applications. And so for there, you would be putting in, you would probably treat you might even use COTS application as your type and sort them into very small to very large applications. And then probably because the testing is going to be specific to that, you might want to use the detailed models for each of those line items to say, you know, how much do I expect to need to test it? Is it a little bit? Is it a lot? Do I expect I'm going to need to modify it at all as a result of this? And so on.
Okay.
And what you can do is you can save both of those as versions into the control center, but have them be part of the same program or the same project, you know, different components of the same project. And then at control center, it'll total up the estimate for you. So that if you wanted to know the total, you would total be a total of the two estimates.
Taking notes.
Control Center is in one of your newer versions, correct?
Yeah, I think that came in version 6 point something, 6.2 maybe, or what? All right. Other questions about any of these components before we move on to the exercises? All right. So project 1 involves installing an SAP OSS patch, fixing 75 defects in the SAP software, and upgrading from IE10 to IE11. What sizing components would you use? Augustine?
Oh, you're picking on me today.
I am picking on you today.
So it's a patch, uplift from IE10 to IE11, and the 75 defects.
So, yep, exactly right. We would have one patch, we would have 75 defects, and we would have one reference architecture uplift. Project 2 involved fixing some performance problems with a software application. The problem may be with the hardware, the application, or both. We're not sure. What sizing components would you use? John, you want to give this a shot?
See, one would be performance consulting. Another would be is it consulting? So it's the one that's broader in scope. Consulting support.
The 4 different types of consulting were performance, security, configuration, and other.
Okay, so I would say performance consulting, other, performance consulting and other consulting.
Okay. Now, the problem with doing it that way is we've given the application team more hours than they need to do their work.
Right.
And we've shortchanged the infrastructure team.
Okay, yeah,
So,
I wasn't specific about which area.
Right. So what we actually want to do is we want to have 2 different consultings. You're right there. But they're both performance consulting. But one of them we'll put on the ExcelerSize tab, and one of them we'll put onto the ODC Other tab. Everybody see that?
Yes.
All right. Project 3 involves installing and configuring the SAP HR module. No extensions are currently anticipated. what sizing component would you use? Gail?
I would do a module, one module.
Exactly. One commercial off-the-shelf software module. Project 4 involves a change request to the ExcelerSize 3 SAP project. The business has identified 10 custom reports, 5 custom workflows, and 2 custom one-way interfaces that must be included in the project. What sizing components would you use for the change request effort? Michelle?
I would do 10 reports, 5 workflows, 2 interfaces, and that would be it. Or I could do, yeah, okay, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, we just keep it.
I could do like a module enhanced easy because it could be just things you're adding on to a module potentially. But this is the best route.
Yeah, exactly. And so keep in mind that any given project is going to be mixtures of all the different components depending on what we're trying to estimate. Student exercise 5. Project 5 involves adding 3 new security roles, 1 new product code, and updating the tax tables for 10 states. What sizing components would you use for the data conversion? Whoops, sorry about that. That's a typo. What sizing component would you use? I was cutting and pasting screens, and I obviously forgot to change one. Shannon?
I would use 1 consulting security, 1 COTS application, and 10 tables.
Okay. So let's talk through your answer a little bit. So first of all, a commercial off-the-shelf application, that's a big thing. That's like installing an SAP or installing a commercial lending system or whatever.
Oh.
So you want to use that. Think about that as your blowtorch, flamethrower, scorched earth. You don't want to use that very often. The 3 new security roles. Well, those are configuration updates, and there's not a lot of specialized consulting that's going to go with that. So whatever consulting is required to add those security roles would be built into the effort to do those configuration updates. The product code is a configuration change normally. And then the tax tables, those are another example of a configuration change within the data that drive the subsequent behavior. But in this case, we've got 10 different states, so I would count that as 10 different configuration changes.
Shouldn't it be 14?
Yeah, where's the 19 come in?
How do you got 19?
You're right. That should be 14. Sorry about that. I've got 2 errors on 1 slide.
And I misread the 1 new product code, because that's just a small piece of it. I now see I shouldn't have said COTS app.
Yep, exactly. Okay, good.
That was still kind of tricky.
Yeah, especially when I've got big information on there. Good catch, though, Michelle. All right. So we've got our 20 minutes for questions. Is everything clear to everybody? Oops. Let's go to here. Any other questions in general? Okay. Well, once again, thank you for your time. We'll see you for the 5th module, and we'll cover the rest of ExcelerSize.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks everybody.
Bye.